I stood in the doorway of what had been our drawing room, watching him practice his smile in the gilt-edged mirror. It was the same smile he had given me 7 years earlier, on the morning of our wedding, before I understood that a smile could be both promise and weapon. The room smelled of beeswax and dying roses. Late afternoon light filtered through damask curtains, casting everything in amber, the Persian carpet beneath my feet, the mahogany furniture we had selected together during the first hopeful months, even the wedding portrait above the mantelpiece where I appeared younger, softer, still believing in permanence. He was adjusting his cravat with careful precision, the way he did everything, as though the perfection of his appearance could somehow compensate for what lay beneath. I had received the letter that morning, not addressed to me, of course. It had been delivered to his study by messenger, but our housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, dear, aging Mrs. Davies, who had served my family before my marriage, had thought it urgent enough to bring to my attention. The paper was thick, expensive, embossed with the Ashworth crest. Lady Ashworth was hosting an intimate gathering at her London residence in 3 weeks' time. A celebration, the letter said, to announce the forthcoming union between her daughter Evelyn and Mr. Thomas Wexford. My husband, my Thomas, though I had already learned he had never truly been mine. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have anticipated, was that I had been keeping watch for longer than he imagined. A woman learns to see in the dark when she lives in shadow. The silent years had taught me patience. I had entered marriage at 22 with romantic notions inherited from novels and my mother's gentle instruction. Thomas had been considered an excellent match. Intelligent, ambitious, from respectable Hampshire gentry, with enough fortune to be comfortable but hungry enough to want more. I had brought a modest dowry and better connections. My father's family had aristocratic branches, though our own line had declined to genteel poverty that required careful management and strategic marriages. I had thought we would build something together. For the first year, perhaps 2, I believed in the fiction we were creating. We attended dinners, paid calls, maintained the small Belgravia house that represented his rising status in parliamentary circles. He spoke often of his career, his aspirations, the importance of strategic alliances. I learned to host, to charm, to be the correct ornament to his ambitions. But children did not come. Month after month, the familiar disappointment. Thomas grew distant, then cold. His visits to my bedroom became increasingly rare, then ceased entirely. In society, he began to speak of me with carefully constructed pity, my delicate constitution, my nervous disposition, my disappointing inability to provide him with an heir. The women at tea would touch my hand with false sympathy. The men would avoid my husband's eye, understanding perfectly what could not be spoken aloud. I had believed the fault was mine. For 3 years, I carried that shame like a stone in my chest, growing smaller and quieter as his world expanded without me. He joined better clubs, attended grander houses, befriended men whose wives wore diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. I remained in the Belgravia house, managing servants, writing letters to distant cousins, reading by the fire while he dined elsewhere. It was Mrs. Davies who first planted the seed of doubt. She had been unusually quiet one morning, her hands trembling as she poured my tea. When I pressed her, she would only say that she had seen things in her years of service, things that made her wonder about the nature of blame and where it truly belonged. She spoke carefully, as servants must, but her meaning was clear enough. Perhaps, she suggested, the problem did not lie where society assumed. I began to pay attention differently. I noticed the young housemaid, Sarah, who had left our service abruptly the previous autumn, returning to her family in the country. I remembered another girl, years earlier, dismissed under mysterious circumstances. I thought of Thomas's frequent absences, his late returns, the careful way he avoided certain topics, and then, quite by accident, I discovered the truth that would become my weapon. It was February, bitterly cold, when I found the first letter. Thomas had left his study unlocked, unusual for him, and I had entered searching for writing paper. The drawer contained correspondence he had not bothered to conceal because he had long since ceased considering me a threat. Letters from women across the past several years, some respectful, some desperate, some angry, but more significantly, letters concerning money, payments to families, arrangements for children. I sat at his desk for an hour, perhaps longer, reading by the light of a single candle as dusk fell. The cold from the window seeped into my bones, but I could not move. The letters told a story of systematic seduction and abandonment. 3 children that I could identify, possibly more. All born to women in his employ or within his social sphere. All quietly paid for and dismissed, the mothers bought off or banished, the children scattered to distant relatives or anonymity. He had been capable all along. The failure, the shame, the social humiliation I had endured, all of it had been constructed to serve his purposes. He needed me to appear barren to justify what he was planning, an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation or my supposed inability to bear children. Freedom to marry Evelyn Ashworth, whose family possessed exactly the wealth and status his ambitions required. I replaced the letters precisely as I had found them. When Thomas returned that evening, I greeted him with perfect composure, inquired about his day, and retired early as I always did. He did not look at me long enough to notice the transformation occurring beneath the surface of my practiced serenity. The fracture had occurred, clean and complete. But I gave no sign. I had learned patience in those silent years. I would need it now. Over the following weeks, I began my careful investigation. I wrote to former servants under the pretense of providing references. I visited the homes of distant acquaintances whose daughters had left service in our household or neighboring ones. I claimed to be compiling family histories, tracing household records, any excuse that might grant me access to the information I needed. Society granted me this freedom because I was considered harmless, a childless wife with too much time, engaging in the sorts of gentle occupations befitting her diminished status. What I discovered exceeded even my initial findings. Thomas had fathered at least 5 children, possibly 6, over the course of our marriage and the years immediately preceding it. The women involved were all socially vulnerable: servants, a governess, the daughter of his tailor. He had used his position and charm methodically, then discarded them with carefully calibrated cruelty wrapped in financial settlements that ensured their silence. One woman, however, had kept letters. Mary Thornton had been a lady's maid in a neighboring household. Thomas had courted her with promises he never intended to keep. When she became pregnant, he had arranged for her dismissal and a small payment, enough to survive but not enough to maintain dignity. She had kept his letters, romantic, explicit, damning, as insurance or perhaps simple memory of what she had lost. When I visited her modest rooms in Whitechapel, bringing gifts and sympathy, she wept and gave me copies of everything. I gathered evidence like a barrister preparing for trial: dates, locations, witnesses who could corroborate. I learned the names of the children and where they had been sent. I documented the payments from Thomas's accounts, tracing the pattern of his deception with meticulous attention. Every piece of information was verified, cross-referenced, preserved in my own private archive, hidden behind the false backing of a jewelry box my mother had given me. Mrs. Davies became my quiet accomplice. She knew people throughout London's servant networks, could gather information that I, despite my connections, could never access. Together, we constructed a complete picture of Thomas's secret life, the one he had so carefully concealed behind the facade of our respectable marriage and his injured dignity at my supposed failures. The invitation to Lady Ashworth's banquet arrived in early March, cream-colored and edged in gold, a celebration of the forthcoming union between Evelyn Ashworth and Thomas Wexford. I was not invited, of course. Our marriage still existed in law, but in society's eyes, I had already been erased, a sad footnote to a man moving toward greater things. But Lady Ashworth did not know everything. Few people did. Thomas had been careful to keep his various transgressions compartmentalized, ensuring that the Ashworths saw only the ambitious politician with an unfortunate first marriage that could be legally dissolved. He had not yet formally filed for annulment. The timing would come after the engagement was publicly celebrated, after the Ashworth fortune was secure in his grasp. I began composing letters. The first went to Lady Ashworth herself, written with careful deference and sealed with my family crest. I explained that I had information regarding Mr. Wexford that her ladyship might wish to review before any announcements became irrevocable. I suggested a private meeting, woman to woman, mother to mother. I enclosed nothing explicit, only the suggestion that all was not as it appeared. Lady Ashworth responded within 2 days. We met at her London townhouse, a magnificent building in Mayfair that made my own home appear quaint by comparison. She received me in a drawing room filled with light and expensive art, her expression carefully controlled, neither friendly nor hostile. She was a woman who understood power, had married into it, and was determined to secure it for her daughter. I laid out the evidence methodically: letters, copies of financial records, testimonies from the women involved, the names and locations of children bearing Thomas's unmistakable features. I spoke without emotion, letting the facts construct their own narrative. Lady Ashworth's face remained composed, but I watched her hands tighten on the arm of her chair, her knuckles whitening as the full scope of Thomas's deception became clear. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, studying the papers spread across the low table between us. Then she looked up, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Why bring this to me?" she asked. "You could simply divorce him, expose him publicly, ruin him yourself." "I could," I agreed. "But divorce would ruin me as well. Society blames the wife as often as the husband, and my family's resources are limited. I would survive, but in poverty and disgrace. Mr. Wexford would still have his charm, his connections, his ability to rebuild. Men like him always do. What do you propose instead? Your banquet is in 10 days. Society will be watching. The engagement will be announced before witnesses who matter, peers, politicians, families whose opinions shape reputations. If the truth were to emerge then, in that setting, the damage would be irreparable, not to me, but to him." Lady Ashworth's expression shifted, understanding blooming into something almost like respect. "You want the revelation to occur at the celebration itself." "I want justice," I said quietly, "and I want to ensure that no other woman suffers what I have suffered, what these others have suffered. Thomas Wexford presents himself as a gentleman of honor. Society should know the truth." We spoke for another hour, planning the details, with the precision of generals arranging a campaign. Lady Ashworth had resources I lacked: access to the highest levels of society, relationships with powerful men who could shape the aftermath, the ability to control the narrative that would follow. In exchange for my evidence, she would ensure that I emerged from this intact, with my reputation preserved and my financial security established. "You understand," she said as I prepared to leave, "that this will be extraordinarily unpleasant for everyone involved, including my daughter." "Better unpleasant now than disastrous later," I replied. "Evelyn is young. She will recover. With your guidance, she will marry better." Lady Ashworth nodded slowly. "You are not what I expected, Mrs. Wexford." "No," I said. "I am what the silent years made me." The 10 days that followed were the longest of my life. I continued my usual routines, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. Thomas was often absent, busy with preparations for the banquet and meetings with the Ashworth family. He spoke to me only when necessary, with the polite distance one might extend to a housekeeper or governess. I had become less than wife, merely the obstacle to be legally removed once his new future was secured. I practiced my expression in the mirror each morning: calm, composed, unreadable. I dressed carefully, selecting garments that conveyed dignity without display. I wrote letters to distant family members, preparing for what would come after, ensuring I had places to go if necessary, connections that would not abandon me when scandal erupted. Mrs. Davies watched me with something like wonder. "You're not afraid," she observed one evening as she helped me dress for dinner alone in my room. "Terror and determination feel remarkably similar," I told her. "I have simply chosen which one to show." The night of the banquet arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind of evening that London occasionally produces when the air is soft and the light turns everything golden. I had not been invited, but Lady Ashworth had made arrangements. I would enter through the servants' entrance, remain in a private room until the moment of revelation, then be brought forward at precisely the correct time. I wore deep blue silk, simple but elegant, my mother's pearl necklace at my throat. I carried nothing except a small reticule containing copies of the most damning letters. The originals remained locked away, insurance against any attempt to silence the truth. The Ashworth townhouse blazed with light and noise. Through the windows, I could see the glittering assembly, women in jewels and silk, men in evening dress, the cream of London society gathered to celebrate a union that would never occur. Music drifted from the ballroom. Champagne flowed. Thomas would be at the center of it all, basking in his victory, believing he had finally achieved the status he craved. Lady Ashworth found me in the small room where I waited. She looked magnificent and formidable, dressed in silver silk with diamonds at her throat and wrists. Her expression was ice. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Yes." "Once this begins, there is no stopping it. Society will talk about this for years." "Good," I said. "Let them remember." She nodded, then swept out, leaving me with a young maid who had been instructed to bring me forward when signaled. I sat in that small room, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration, feeling my heartbeat steady and sure. All the silent years had led to this moment. All the shame and diminishment and quiet rage had been distilled into this single point of action. The signal came. The maid touched my shoulder, and I rose, smoothing my skirts, checking once more that the letters were secure. We moved through the servants' corridors toward the main ballroom. The maid opened a concealed door in the paneling, and suddenly I was at the edge of the celebration, hidden behind a screen, but able to see everything. Thomas stood on a low platform at the far end of the ballroom, Lady Ashworth beside him, Evelyn at his side looking young and radiant in white silk. Lord Ashworth was speaking, welcoming the assembly, beginning the formal announcement that would bind their families together. Thomas's face glowed with triumph. Lady Ashworth caught my eye across the room and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then she stepped forward, interrupting her husband with graceful authority. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the suddenly silent room, "there is a matter that must be addressed, a matter of truth and consequence." The assembly stirred, confused. Thomas's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing his features for the first time. Lady Ashworth gestured, and I stepped out from behind the screen, walking forward through the crowd that parted before me like water. The recognition rippled through the room. Mrs. Wexford, the forgotten wife. What was she doing here? I climbed the low steps to stand beside Lady Ashworth, facing the assembly. Thomas had gone pale, his composure fracturing visibly. Evelyn looked bewildered, glancing between her mother, Thomas, and me with growing alarm. "My name is Catherine Wexford," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I have been married to Thomas Wexford for 7 years. During that time, society has been led to believe that I am barren, unable to provide my husband with children. This belief has been carefully cultivated by Mr. Wexford himself, preparing the ground for an annulment that would free him to pursue this more advantageous union." The room held its breath. No one moved. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but Lady Ashworth silenced him with a single gesture. "The truth," I continued, "is somewhat different. Mr. Wexford is indeed a father, multiple times over. He has fathered at least 5 children during our marriage, possibly more. Children born to servants, to women in socially vulnerable positions, women he seduced with promises and abandoned with payments meant to ensure their silence." I reached into my reticule and withdrew the letters, holding them up so the assembly could see. "I have documentation, letters in Mr. Wexford's own hand, financial records showing payments to these women, testimonies from the women themselves, and witnesses who can corroborate every claim." The room erupted, not in loud chaos, but in the particular kind of scandal-shocked murmuring that Victorian society produced. Furious whispers, sharp intakes of breath, fans snapping open to conceal shocked expressions. Thomas lunged forward, reaching for the letters, but Lord Ashworth stepped between us, his face thunderous. "You would accuse a gentleman," Thomas began, his voice cracking. "I accuse a liar," I said, my voice cutting through his attempted defense. "I accuse a man who has systematically deceived everyone in this room, who has built his reputation on false claims and discarded women like refuse when they became inconvenient." Lady Ashworth moved to stand beside me, a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. "I have reviewed Mrs. Wexford's evidence personally," she said, addressing the assembly. "It is comprehensive and damning. The engagement announcement will not proceed. Mr. Wexford is no longer welcome in this house or in association with this family." Evelyn had begun to cry, her mother moving swiftly to embrace her, leading her from the platform. The young woman's humiliation was unfortunate, but necessary, I told myself. Better this than years of discovering the same truths I had learned. Thomas stood alone now on the platform, his triumph completely reversed. The assembly drew back from him as though from contagion. Men he had courted as allies, women who had pitied me while dismissing him of blame, all of them now understanding the full scope of his deception. Lord Ashworth's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority. "I believe, Wexford, that your presence is no longer required. I suggest you leave London entirely. There are few places in society where you will be welcome after tonight." Thomas looked at me then, finally, truly seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. His expression cycled through rage, panic, and something that might have been recognition. The mousy, invisible wife had become his destruction. "You've ruined me," he said, his voice barely audible. "No," I replied. "You ruined yourself. I simply told the truth." He left without dignity, pushing through the crowd that opened before him with palpable distaste. The footman escorted him out, and I never saw him again. The aftermath unfolded across the following weeks and months with the particular drama that only London society could produce. The story spread through drawing rooms and clubs like wildfire. Thomas's political aspirations collapsed immediately. His friends abandoned him. The annulment he had planned became a divorce, filed by me instead, with Lady Ashworth's family providing the legal resources and social protection I needed. The women he had wronged found themselves suddenly believed, their stories validated by my public revelation. Several received increased financial settlements. The children were traced and provided for through a fund established by Lady Ashworth, who had taken a surprisingly personal interest in ensuring they had opportunities their father had denied them. Society's response to me was complex. Some women regarded me with suspicion or discomfort. I had broken the rules of silence, had made public what should have remained private. But others, especially those who had suffered similar treatments in their own marriages, treated me with a new kind of respect. I had done what they could not or would not do. I had spoken truth to power and survived. The Ashworth family became unlikely allies. Lady Ashworth invited me to dinners, introduced me to influential connections, ensured that I was received in houses that might otherwise have closed their doors. She told me once, privately, that she admired what I had done, that society needed more women willing to challenge the comfortable lies that protected unworthy men. My own family, initially horrified by the scandal, gradually came to accept what had happened. My father, in particular, seemed to recognize something he had not seen before, that his daughter possessed a strength and intelligence he had never properly acknowledged. He increased my allowance, ensured my financial independence, made it clear that I would always have a home and position within the family. I moved from the Belgravia house to a smaller but more comfortable residence in Bloomsbury, a neighborhood where writers and artists lived alongside genteel families, where unconventional women could exist without constant scrutiny. I began to rebuild a life that was entirely my own, not defined by marriage or by the man who had tried to erase me. Mrs. Davies came with me, of course, and we hired other women who had nowhere else to go. Former servants, governesses past their prime, women whom society had discarded. Our household became a quiet refuge, a place where women supported each other without judgment or expectation. I did not remarry. Several men expressed interest over the following years, intrigued perhaps by my notoriety or genuinely admiring my independence. But I had no desire to repeat the experiment of marriage. I had learned that I was complete without a husband's validation, that my worth existed independent of social approval or romantic attachment. Instead, I wrote. At first, simply personal journals, working through the emotions and memories that still surfaced unexpectedly. But gradually, I began writing stories, fictional accounts of women navigating betrayal and constraint, finding ways to reclaim power within the systems that sought to diminish them. A small publishing house, run by a woman whose own marriage had ended in scandal, agreed to publish my work under a pseudonym. The books found an audience. Women wrote to me, care of the publisher, sharing their own stories, asking advice, expressing gratitude that someone had articulated what they had felt but could not say. I answered every letter, creating a secret network of correspondence that connected women across England, all of us supporting each other through the particular challenges of Victorian womanhood. Years passed. I watched Evelyn Ashworth marry a young earl with genuine kindness in his eyes. I attended their wedding at Lady Ashworth's invitation, wearing lavender silk and feeling no regret. Thomas's name faded from conversation, then from memory. He had left England, I heard, for America or Australia, somewhere distant enough to attempt reinvention. I did not think of him often. When I did, I felt neither satisfaction nor bitterness, only a strange neutrality. He had been the catalyst for my transformation, but he was not the substance of it. The woman I had become existed independent of him, shaped by the silent years, but no longer defined by them. On the 15th anniversary of that banquet, I sat in the small garden behind my Bloomsbury house, drinking tea as spring flowers bloomed around me. Mrs. Davies brought out my correspondence, letters from readers, invitations to literary gatherings, a note from Lady Ashworth asking if I would visit her in the country. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. A young woman arrived for tea, a friend's daughter seeking advice about a difficult engagement. She had heard my story, she said hesitantly, and wondered if I might understand her situation. I listened to her tale of a charming fiancé with secrets, a family pressing for alliance over wisdom, her own doubts dismissed as feminine nervousness. "What should I do?" she asked finally, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Only you can answer that," I told her gently. "But I can tell you this. Silence protects those who should not be protected. Truth, spoken at the right moment in the right way, can change everything. The cost is real. Society dislikes discomfort, and you will bear the burden of having disrupted the comfortable lies. But the alternative cost, years of your life given to someone unworthy, may be far greater." She left with resolve in her bearing, and I hoped she would find her own path, whatever that might be. That evening, as the light faded and the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, I stood at my window looking out over London. Somewhere in this vast metropolis, women were making choices, enduring betrayals, discovering strength they did not know they possessed. Some would remain silent, and I did not judge them for it. Silence had its own survival logic, but others would speak. Others would refuse to accept the limits imposed upon them. Others would discover, as I had, that reputation could be reconstructed, that disgrace survived, became armor, that the power they had been taught to deny themselves had existed all along, waiting only for the courage to claim it. I had paid a price for my truth. Scandal, social disruption, years of careful navigation through a society that remained suspicious of women who refused victimhood. But I had also gained something immeasurably precious. Myself, whole and undivided, belonging only to my own judgment and conscience. The silent years were over, and in the space they left behind, I had built a life of my own design.